So far in this module, we've considered why we might want to classify marine environments into ecosystems. Having well-defined units can be useful in developing plans for marine conservation. It can also be useful for assessing the status of marine environments and which areas might need rehabilitation or changes in management strategies. In this little lectorial, what we're going to do is actually consider how we might go about classifying marine ecosystems. Various jurisdictions use different approaches. The European Union has their approach, the Australian government has their own approach. What I'm going to do today is actually talk you through a framework that's recently been developed in the United States for classification of their estuarine and coastal environments. And this classification scheme is based around 6 categories: the biogeographic setting, the aquatic setting, the water column component, the geoform component, the substrate component, and the biotic component. And these are arranged in a hierarchy, with the biogeographic setting obviously being a very large scale, moving through to the biotic component at the smaller scale. So what I would like to do today is actually talk you through each of these components that contribute to this hierarchical classification scheme and what kinds of things we might want to actually consider in classifying ecosystems. So we're going to start at this larger scale, the biogeographic setting, and we're going to consider how where we are in the world might influence and become important in classifying ecosystems. So when we're considering biogeographic setting, at the largest scale we can talk about realms. And this slide here shows a scheme of oceanographic realms that Bailey from the US Department of Agriculture came up with some years ago. And the first thing that you'll notice about this particular scheme is that there are strong latitudinal patterns in the size and shape of these realms. So you can see that there are particular realms that tend to be based at the equator, and there are conversely particular realms that tend to span the polar regions. And this is because a whole suite of environmental conditions tend to vary with latitude. So at low latitudes, what we tend to find is that we have good availability of light throughout the year. Day length does not change terribly much from the summer to the winter months. Whereas in the higher latitudes, what we tend to find is that we have certain seasons where there are a lot of light, but over the winter months there is not much light at all. And so this is a constraint on primary production in these systems and drives the types of organisms that can actually survive in these systems, and indeed whether organisms in these systems are going to be year-round residents or are going to come and go with the seasons. The other thing that is going to be strongly influenced by latitude is temperature, and we'll get to temperature a little bit more a bit later. So we would expect that close to the equator, the temperature of surface waters is going to be much warmer than as we move into the polar regions. And this too is going to influence organisms because temperature is a key control on metabolic processes, and temperature is one of the key conditions which organisms have an optimum for. And outside of that optimum, they are going to perform either with reduced fitness or alternatively are not going to be able to survive. The other thing that you will notice about this particular scheme of realms is that a lot of them are sort of fairly square in shape and sit between several of the continents in ocean basins, and this is reflecting the circulation patterns of oceans. So within oceans there are circulation patterns that tend to connect bodies of water and also tend to transport organisms that have a pelagic stage in their life history. At smaller scales, we can consider bioregions, and this particular slide here shows the IMCRW bioregions of Australia. IMCRW stands for Integrated Marine and Coastal Regionalisation Australia. And if you count up each of these coloured bits, each of which is a bioregion, you would see that there are 41 provincial bioregions in Australia. And this particular scheme was revised in 2006 to the form that we see today. And this particular scheme is based on available information on the distributions of species, in particular habitat-forming species, which in turn drive the types of species that live with them. So, for example, distributions of things like kelps, of corals, of oysters, of mangroves, of seagrass beds, that kind of thing, which we know from habitat mapping. It's also based on available information on the distributions of fish and invertebrates as well, and where the distributions of these species tend to end. And what we tend to find is that there are certain areas along the coast where actually the distributions of a whole suite of species tend to stop and tend to start. And these can be related to patterns of currents and eddies. These can be related to land-based barriers that impede the movement of species up and down the coast. It can also be due to changes in climate that make the environment unsuitable for, say, tropical species to be found below a certain point of the coastline. So at the next level down, what we have is aquatic setting. And aquatic setting is to do with whereabouts we are in the water column and whether we're on the bottom of the ocean or if we're floating around in the water column. And so the first consideration is, of course, whether we are on the bottom or whether we're in the water column. And you may recall that pelagic is the word we use in marine science to refer to those things that are floating around in the water. And benthic refers to organisms and processes that are happening on the bottom. And within these two provinces, the next consideration is how far we are from the surface. So obviously on the surface, processes are going to be very different to deeper below the surface. On the surface, we tend to have greater light availability. We have got warmer temperatures. We have got mixing of waters by wind generators, waves, which tend to make a more homogeneous environment where conditions don't change so rapidly with depth. Below the surface, light drops off, temperature decreases, but what we tend to get is greater accumulation of nutrients and organic matter, which tend to sink under gravity to the bottom of the ocean. And so within each of the pelagic and the benthic province, what we have is a number of terms that actually explain or are used to describe where we are in the water column. So if we start with the pelagic province, the top stratum, the shallowest zone is the epipelagic, which is found down to a depth of 200 metres. So this is generally the area the deepest area which could possibly be mixed by wind-generated waves and sort of surface processes. Below this we have the mesopelagic zone, which extends from 200 metres to 1,000 metres below the surface of the ocean. We have got bathypelagic, which is 1,000 to 2,000 metres below the surface. We have the abyssal pelagic, which is from 2,000 to 6,000 metres below. And we have got the hadal-pelagic, which is our deepest zone, which is deeper than 6,000 metres. Now, if we consider the benthic provinces, you will see that some of the names are very similar to the pelagic, which is good, which makes them easier to remember, and some are slightly different. So if we start at the surface with the benthic as well, the top zone is called the littoral, or otherwise known as the intertidal. And this is the area that is inundated at high tide, but is high and dry and exposed to the air at low tide. Below this we have the sublittoral zone, which is permanently inundated but is a shallow water environment. And so this is generally the water that sits on top of the continental shelf and water that's no more than about 200 metres deep. As we move into deeper waters and down the continental slope, we get into the bathyal zone, which is 200 to 2,000 metres deep. Below this we have the abyssal, which is 2,000 to 6,000 metres, and this is actually the particular depth strata that makes up most of the world's oceans. This is really, really common, about 70%, and some of you will actually be looking at the abyssal bottom in your review of a particular ecosystem in the next section of this module. And the deepest is the hadal, and so you can see that the naming here is very similar to the pelagic province. So moving along, we now have a whole heap of finer scale features that we need to consider. So these are the water column component. So these are structures and features of the water column, so things like temperature, things like salinity, things like concentration of nutrients and biogeochemical processes. We then have the geoform component, and so this is to do with the topography of the bottom. Do we have seamounts? Do we have things like trenches or ridges that are going to influence the depth of surface that's available to organisms, currents, flow, and in turn the types of organisms we're going to find. We have the substrate component, so this is whether we have a hard bottom or a soft sedimentary bottom, if it's muddy or whether it's sandy, that kind of thing. And then finally we have the biotic component, which is related to the species that we actually find either on the bottom or floating and suspended on the water. And so what we'll do now is consider each of these in a little bit more detail. So if we start with the water quality component, as I said before, one of the key considerations is salinity, because obviously all organisms are bathed in water and are exposed to salinity. It is going to influence osmotic processes. Certain organisms are going to be able to deal with high salinities. Certain organisms are only going to be able to deal with lower salinities. And what we see is that salinity actually varies considerably around the world. And so in the open ocean, what we might expect to see is salinities that are somewhere in the range of 32 to 38 practical salinity units with a mean of about 35. So this is, I guess, what we usually think of when we think about the salinity of the ocean, somewhere in the order of 35. But if we move into shallow coastal areas, what we often see is that the salinity is a little bit less. It is more in the range of 27 to 30 practical salinity units. And this is because in the coastal region, what we have is the influence of runoff of fresh water from the land. So rivers are discharging into the coastal environment. Some of these have quite a large plume and a large volume of water that's being ejected across the continental shelf. We have diffuse runoff from the land as well, and that tends to decrease salinity. If we think about estuaries, so estuaries could be considered a component of the marine environment. Estuaries are just semi-enclosed bodies of water that at one end have an either permanent or intermittent connection with the ocean and have some measure of dilution with fresh water as well. So with estuaries, near where their entrance to estuaries, where they have their connection with the ocean, we might expect that when the estuary is open to the ocean, there is going to be a lot of exchange, tidal exchange between the estuary and the ocean waters, and so our salinity is going to be very close to that of the coastal ocean, so in the order of 30 practical salinity units. But as we move inside the estuary, the tidal influence is going to diminish, and what we're going to see is an increasing freshwater influence. So as we move up the estuary, there's going to be a stronger influence of the fresh water that's moving down through river systems, fresh water that is running off the land through diffuse runoff from impermeable surfaces like the concrete, the roads that we build in our cities. Then we move on to semi-enclosed seas. So we can have instances like the Baltic Sea, where we have got some minimal connection with the ocean, the wider ocean, but what we have is a lot of runoff into these areas from the land without that much evaporation, and so what we tend to have is a slightly lower salinity than the open ocean salinity because of this freshwater influence. In other instances, what we tend to have is lots and lots of evaporation of water from these basins, so in very hot, dry areas, without much freshwater input. And so in these cases, what we can actually have is a salinity that is much more saline than the open ocean. This is called hypersalinity, and that's why in the Red Sea you tend to float, because the water is very, very dense because of this high salinity. So salinity varies considerably with environment, and this might in turn be expected to influence the types of fauna and flora that we can find in different parts of our marine environment. The second abiotic consideration of water quality that's really important is temperature. And first of all, temperature can vary around the world spatially according to latitude, in particular sea surface temperature. And so this slide here is a schematic of how temperature varies with latitude. And so as you can see from this, the warmer water, which is denoted by sort of the orangey colours here, are primarily in the equatorial regions, and colder waters are found towards the poles, which are the deeper blue colours here. And so if we're thinking about surface waters, tropical waters generally have surface water temperature of around 25 degrees Celsius, subtropical maybe in the order of 15 degrees Celsius. Temperate areas can get down to 5 degrees Celsius in their northern limit, and as low as 2 degrees Celsius in their southern limit, if we're talking about the southern hemisphere. And the polar, we can get less than 2 degrees Celsius. So you can see that there's quite a lot of variation in sea surface temperatures, and this is going to influence organisms because temperature influences metabolic processes. The warmer the temperature, the faster the processes that are going to go, and some organisms are able to withstand really hot temperatures. Some of them aren't going to be able to cope with those conditions. Not only does temperature have a spatial biogeographic dimension, but it also has a depth dimension as well. So because the water is being heated by the sun, what we would expect is that the temperature of our oceans are going to be warmest at the surface, and that temperature is going to decrease as we move down below the surface. And what we tend to find actually is that in the top 100 or 200 metres of the oceans, there's actually not a lot of change in temperature as we move down through the water column, and this is because of mixing. So waves, big storm generated waves, tend to mix the surface waters of the ocean, and what this tends to do is mix properties of the ocean so they're more consonant with depth in this first range. But once we move beyond or below this point at which mixing can occur, we reach the thermocline, and the thermocline is that layer of water at which the temperature very, very rapidly drops off. And then below the thermocline, we see decreasing temperature with depth, but not at that same rate as in the thermocline here. As well as considering temperature, we also need to consider the availability of nutrients in the water. So organisms have macronutrients that they need in large quantities in order to support their structure and function, and micronutrients that they need in smaller quantities. And so this was the slide of temperature, the graphic of temperature that we showed before, where temperature isn't changing much as we move down the top 200 or a couple of surface waters, and then it is a thermocline, and then it drops off steeply. But with phosphate and nitrate, what we see is a very different pattern. So we see that nutrients tend to be much less abundant in the surface water. So in this graph here, we've got concentration of nutrients on the x-axis going across the top, and we've got depth going down the y-axis. Okay, so you can see in the shallow waters here, very little nutrients, and this is the same right throughout these surface waters that are mixed by waves. But once we get below this zone of mixing, what we see is nutrient concentrations tend to start to increase and are actually highest at the bottom of our oceans. Why is this the case? Well, first of all, it is the case because in the surface waters, this is where we have most of our biological production, and organisms actually take up nutrients because they require nutrients for biological processes, and this act of organisms taking up nutrients are going to decrease their availability in the environment. So that's the first reason. The second reason is gravity. So things tend to sink, and things tend to end up at the bottom of the ocean. So that includes nutrients. And in particular, I guess if all the nutrients are tied up in aquatic organisms, what tends to happen is that those aquatic organisms are eventually going to die and move on, and the organic material, that dead animal or dead plant, is actually going to fall to the bottom of the ocean. And so those nutrients are going to accumulate in the ocean, where they will be released by decomposition processes. So that's why we tend to have highest nutrient concentrations at the bottom of the ocean. Let's just skip to this end one now. So this is primary production. And so as you would expect here, what we see is that pretty much all of our primary production is in occurring in the surface waters. Once we move below about 80 metres or so, you can see that there is very, very little primary production, and this is obviously because there is not enough light to support it. Interestingly, if we look at chlorophyll concentrations, what we see, pardon me, is an interesting pattern where chlorophyll actually peaked a little bit below the surface of the water. And this is probably due to this trade-off between needing to have enough light but also needing to have enough nutrient for primary production and biological activities. So if we're just below the surface, we might still have some light, but we're also going to have higher concentrations of nutrients as well. Okay, so moving right along, the next thing that we need to consider in our classification schemes is geoform, and geoform refers to the bottom topography. So whether there is a mid-ocean ridge or a trench, or whether there's little seamounts, or what the topography is like. And topography is going to influence I guess both the depth of the substrate, so how far below the surface of the ocean we are. Also, it's going to influence the way that the water interacts with the bottom, so, you know, currents and that kind of thing, and that in turn is going to influence organisms. And then thinking about the bottom, we also need to consider the substrate type. So do we have a sedimentary environment where organisms can actually burrow into the third dimension and actually live inside the sediment? Or do we have a rocky environment where organisms can live on the rock but they can't actually live in the rock? And this is going to influence things like competition for space, because this is a three-dimensional environment, whereas this bottom type is primarily two-dimensional. You can't live inside the rock. The other thing we need to consider is if it is a sedimentary environment, the sediment grain size distribution is. So muddier sediments tend to be colonised by different types of organisms to sandier sediments. So muddy sediments tend to be very, very rich in organic material. They've got lots of fine organic particles trapped between the mud. And so this tends to be a very food-rich environment for things like deposit feeders that actually ingest sediment and extract the organic matter from in amongst the grains of sand for their nutrition. Sandy sediments tend to have less of this organic material, so the organisms that live in sandy sediment might either need to graze the surface, microalgae attached to the grains of sand if it's in a shallow water environment, or if it's in a deeper water environment, they might be dependent on filter feeding and actually relying on particles that are being transported in the water column and filtering those out. And then when we're talking about rocky surfaces, we can have more complex and more simple structures which are going to influence the hidey holes for organisms to seek refuge from predation and from currents and waves and that kind of thing. And also at the finer scale, the texture, which is going to influence how well organisms can attach to the various surfaces. And then finally, at the lowest level of our hierarchy, we have the biotic component. And often when we're considering the biotic component, what we think about is habitat-forming species. So these are conspicuous species, often dominant within their environments locally, that form some kind of structural habitat or modify the environment by providing shade or slowing currents, making it habitable for other organisms. So the types of habitats that we might consider are things like seagrass beds, mangroves, oyster reefs, coral reefs and salt marshes in estuarine and coastal environments, and some of these are particular habitats that you guys are going to be considering in the papers that you're going to read in the next section. In deeper areas we might also have kelp forests, or we can also have things like abyssal plains, unstructured sedimentary environments deeper in the ocean. And so overall, basically these various layers fit together to provide a classification scheme. So initially what we're considering is where in the world we are, what is the climate like in that particular environment, that particular part of the world. Are we considering benthic or pelagic systems? How far below the surface of the ocean are we working? What is the water chemistry? What is the bottom type like? Are there any particular bathymetric features that might be important, and then finally, what is the structural habitat like that might support other organisms. So in this unit, we're primarily going to be working at the level of the biotic components, so structural habitats, and we're primarily going to be focusing on a single biogeographic region and a single aquatic setting. So we're going to mostly be focusing our attention in the temperate zone because that is where we live, and I guess where the issues are most real to us. That's where also most of the world's population live as well. And we're going to be considering primarily the coastal zone because this is where there is this interaction between natural resources and people, and where there is going to be greatest conflict for resources, although in some of the modules, deep sea oil and gas extraction will also consider deeper areas as well. So in the next section of the unit of this particular module, we will consider some of the biotic components in greater detail. Thank you.